The rancher saved an Apache woman from certain death. What her tribe did next changed his life. Daniel had always lived a quiet life on his ranch. His days were long, filled with hard work and the endless rhythms of the land. He knew every inch of his property, from the rolling hills where his cattle grazed to the dry riverbeds that cut through the desert like silver lines. The sun rose early and set late, painting the sky with colors that never seemed to repeat. Daniel liked this life of solitude. He did not need the noise of towns or the constant chatter of people. His world was his ranch, his animals, and the open sky above him. Yet he had never imagined that one single day could change his life forever. It was early morning when Daniel set out to check the farthest edge of his property. The air was dry and smelled faintly of sagebrush. His boots crunched over the sandy soil as he walked, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble among the cattle. He had learned over the years that danger often came quietly. A stray coyote, a sick calf, or even a sudden summer storm could create problems if he was not paying attention. But nothing could have prepared him for the sound he heard that morning, a faint cry almost swallowed by the wind. Daniel stopped immediately. He listened carefully, turning his head from side to side. There it was again, a human cry, weak and desperate. He frowned. People rarely ventured near this part of the land. It was too dry, too isolated, and not many had reason to cross the desert so far. His heart began to beat faster. He knew someone needed help, and that person could not survive alone in the harsh sun for long. Without a second thought, Daniel set off toward the sound. The cry led him to a narrow, dry riverbed. The sand here was soft and dotted with scrubby bushes. As he approached, he saw her, an Apache woman, barely conscious, lying on the ground. Her clothes were torn and dusty, her skin burned by the sun, and her breathing was shallow. She looked as if she had been wandering for days without water or food. Daniel's stomach tightened. He knew immediately that if he did not act fast, she would not survive another hour in the desert. "Hold on," he said softly, speaking more to himself than to her. He knelt beside her and offered the small canteen of water he always carried. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, but her lips barely moved. She could not speak, or perhaps she did not know his language. Still, Daniel did not hesitate. He poured a little water onto her lips. She drank slowly, greedily, as if the water itself was life itself returning to her. Carefully, he lifted her, supporting her weight against his chest. She was light, almost fragile, but every movement was slow and painful for her. Daniel carried her back to his horse, gently lifting her onto the saddle. The horse, calm and familiar with Daniel, stepped carefully along the uneven ground, as if understanding the importance of the moment. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them relentlessly. Daniel kept talking softly to her, hoping that even words she did not understand could bring comfort. By the time they reached the ranch cabin, the woman was trembling. Daniel laid her on a clean blanket he had prepared earlier that morning, before he even knew he would need it. He fetched fresh water and a simple meal of bread and dried meat, offering it to her again. Slowly she ate, her hands shaky, her eyes wary, but trusting him more with every small action. Daniel realized that her life depended entirely on him now. He had never felt this kind of responsibility before. It was heavy, but it was also something that awakened a strange warmth inside him, a feeling that went beyond kindness or duty. Over the next hours, Daniel did everything he could to make her comfortable. He cleaned her wounds with water and simple herbs, making sure not to cause more pain. He made a fire to warm the cabin as the desert night crept in, and he adjusted the blankets around her, careful not to disturb her fragile body. He learned her name that evening when she whispered it softly in broken words. Nayeli. The sound of her name was gentle, almost musical, and Daniel felt a connection grow silently between them. They could not understand each other fully, but the trust began to form in small ways. Through gestures, through shared moments of quiet care, Daniel watched her sleep that night and thought about how unpredictable life could be. He had always been careful, always kept to his routines, and yet this unexpected encounter had pulled him into a story he could never have imagined. He felt a mixture of fear and awe. Fear, because he knew the desert could be merciless and he was responsible for her survival. Awe, because he recognized the fragile beauty of life, how one small act could mean the difference between living and dying. When morning came, Daniel continued to care for Nayeli. He gave her more water and food, helping her sit up, even if just for a few minutes. She was still weak, but she had a spark in her eyes, a sign that she was beginning to recover. Daniel realized that he needed to be patient. Healing would take time, and he could not rush it. He spent the day moving quietly around her, doing chores, preparing simple meals, and keeping her safe from the harsh sun and the animals that roamed the land. Despite their differences, a silent communication developed between them. Daniel learned to notice the subtle signals Nayeli gave, the way she reached for water, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the small nods or shakes of her head that spoke volumes. Nayeli, in turn, began to trust him. She allowed him to touch her wounds, to help her stand, to guide her through the cabin and the small yard outside. It was slow, careful progress, but it was progress nonetheless. By the end of the first week, Nayeli had regained a little strength. She could sit without support, drink water without trembling, and even eat small portions of food with her hands. Daniel noticed her eyes brightening, her movements becoming more confident. There was still a long way to go, but he felt hope. And with hope came another feeling, something he had not felt in years. He realized that he no longer wanted to return to the solitary life he had known before. Something about helping her, about witnessing her survival, had awakened a connection he could not explain. That week also brought challenges. Daniel had to keep her safe not only from the desert, but also from curiosity. A few neighbors had noticed unusual activity at the ranch and had warned him, speaking harshly about helping an Apache woman. Some even hinted at danger if the tribe discovered her whereabouts. But Daniel refused to let fear guide him. He understood that Nayeli's life mattered more than gossip or threats. His choices, he decided, would be guided by compassion and courage, not by caution or prejudice. By the end of that first week, Daniel and Nayeli had settled into a quiet rhythm. He continued his ranch work while keeping an eye on her, and she began to explore the cabin carefully, learning the space and even managing small tasks. It was not easy, but there was a sense of peace between them. Daniel often found himself talking to her softly about his life, about the animals, about the land, even though he knew she might not understand every word, and somehow the words themselves carried comfort. Nayeli would listen, her eyes following him, sometimes nodding, sometimes resting with a small smile. In those days, Daniel realized something profound. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and yet it could be beautiful in ways one could never plan. He had spent years tending the land and the cattle, thinking he understood the world. But Nayeli's presence, her vulnerability, and her courage were teaching him lessons he had never learned before. Survival was not just about hard work. It was about care, patience, and connection. And perhaps, he thought, this small act of saving her life would lead to changes he could not yet imagine. As the sun set on the ranch that week, Daniel looked at Nayeli sleeping quietly on the blanket. The desert sky glowed with colors he had seen 1,000 times but now seemed more vivid. He felt a strange mixture of exhaustion, relief, and anticipation. The world had shifted, ever so slightly, because he had chosen to act, to reach out to someone in need. And Daniel knew, deep in his heart, that this was only the beginning. Something important had begun. Something that could change both of their lives forever. The days after Nayeli began to regain her strength were both challenging and quietly rewarding for Daniel. The small cabin that had once been his place of solitude now felt alive with the presence of another human being. Even though they could not fully speak each other's language, there was an unspoken understanding growing between them. Daniel noticed her movements becoming more confident each day. She no longer flinched at every sound, and her hands, once shaky and weak, could now hold a cup of water steadily. It was a slow, careful progress, but Daniel took every small sign of improvement as a victory. Each morning, Daniel woke before the sun, as he had done for years, but now he had another reason to rise early. He would bring water and simple food to Nayeli, carefully helping her sit up on the blankets. He watched her face as she drank, seeing the colors slowly return to her cheeks. The desert was still harsh, but Daniel had created a small space where she could recover safely. He began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. The way the sunlight fell across the floorboards, the quiet noises of the desert animals, and the faint smell of sage and dust carried by the wind. He shared these small observations with her, pointing to the animals, the plants, and the horizon, speaking slowly and clearly. Even though she could not understand all the words, she would look and nod, as if absorbing everything he said. One afternoon, Daniel went out to repair a fence near the edge of the property. Nayeli followed him slowly, walking carefully with the aid of a stick he had found for her. She moved with caution but determination, showing Daniel that she was growing stronger and more confident with each day. When they reached the broken fence, he handed her a small hammer and nails, teaching her how to help in a simple way. At first, she struggled, missing the nails or gripping the hammer awkwardly. But Daniel was patient, guiding her hands and demonstrating slowly. By the end of the day, the fence was mended and Nayeli's face showed a proud smile. Daniel realized that this small cooperation, this tiny shared task, was helping them communicate without words. In the evenings, Daniel often sat by the fire while Nayeli rested on the blankets. Sometimes he would tell her about his life, about the cattle, the land, and the routines that had filled his days. He spoke slowly, carefully, so she could catch the tone even if not every word. Nayeli, in turn, began to share small things about her own life. She pointed to her hair, her hands, and her clothing to indicate her experiences, using gestures and expressions to explain her story. Daniel learned that she had been traveling with a small group from her tribe when she became separated. She had survived alone in the desert for days, relying on what little she could find. The story filled Daniel with both admiration and concern. He realized the strength she had shown, enduring such hardship with courage and resilience. Over time, Daniel noticed that Nayeli began to anticipate the daily routine. She would sit near the door in the morning, ready for the water and bread he brought. She would follow him during chores, sometimes pausing to point at an animal or a plant, showing curiosity about his world. Daniel found himself observing her closely, marveling at the way she noticed things he had ignored for years. There was a quiet intelligence in her eyes, a deep awareness of her surroundings that reminded him that survival in the desert required more than strength. It required observation, patience, and respect for the land. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Nayeli's wounds sometimes flared with pain, and she grew tired quickly during their daily walks. Daniel had to constantly adjust their pace, careful not to push her too far. Some days, she would wake in the night, frightened by dreams or noises from the desert. Daniel would sit by her side, holding her hand gently until she calmed. He realized that healing was not just physical, it was emotional as well. She had faced danger and isolation for days, and the memories lingered in subtle ways. Daniel did his best to offer comfort, knowing that trust and patience were as important as food and water. Daniel also had to navigate the opinions of others in the area. A few neighbors had become aware that he was helping someone from a nearby tribe. They warned him, speaking of dangers and traditions he might not understand. Some implied that trouble could follow if he continued to harbor Nayeli. But Daniel was unwavering. He had seen what could happen to someone left alone in the desert, and he could not turn away. To him, saving Nayeli was not a question of rules or fear. It was simply the right thing to do. He chose to follow his conscience rather than the opinions of others, and in doing so, he found a quiet strength he had not known he possessed. As the days turned into weeks, Nayeli's body grew stronger. She could now walk longer distances without help, and she began to take part in small chores around the cabin. She gathered firewood, fetched water from the well, and even helped Daniel prepare meals. Their daily routines began to intertwine, forming a rhythm of mutual care and respect. Daniel noticed that Nayeli began to smile more often, her eyes brighter, and her movements more assured. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that his efforts were making a real difference in her life. Their communication improved slowly. Daniel began to learn a few words in her language, practicing pronunciation carefully. Nayeli, in turn, tried to mimic some of his words, and though imperfect, these attempts created moments of laughter and connection. They discovered that words were not the only way to understand each other. A simple gesture, a shared task, or even a glance could convey feelings of care, gratitude, and trust. Daniel marveled at how deeply two people could connect without sharing a common language. It was a reminder that kindness and patience could bridge any gap. One evening, as the sun set and painted the desert sky with shades of pink and orange, Daniel noticed Nayeli staring at the horizon. She pointed toward the distant mountains and made a small sound, as if telling him a story he could not yet understand. Daniel nodded, smiling, and simply stood with her in quiet companionship. In that moment, he realized that their bond had grown stronger than he could have imagined in such a short time. He felt a sense of responsibility, yes, but also a deep respect and admiration for her courage and resilience. By the end of the second week, Daniel began to consider the future. Nayeli could not stay on the ranch forever. She belonged with her tribe, and it would be his responsibility to return her safely. The thought made him anxious. He had grown accustomed to her presence, and the idea of letting her go was frightening. Yet he also understood that doing the right thing sometimes required courage and sacrifice. He resolved that when the time came, he would help her return home, no matter how difficult the journey might be. As they prepared for the eventual journey back to her tribe, Daniel continued the daily routines that had become familiar to both of them. He watched her grow stronger each day, taking pride in her small victories and the slow but steady restoration of her health. He also reflected on how much this experience had changed him. He had always been a solitary man, comfortable with his routines and the quiet of the desert. But caring for Nayeli had opened his heart in ways he could not have anticipated. He had learned patience, empathy, and the power of trust. Daniel also began to learn more about the Apache way of life through Nayeli's gestures and explanations. She pointed to plants, showing which were edible or useful for medicine. She demonstrated small practices that helped her survive in the desert, even when resources were scarce. Daniel paid close attention, realizing that her knowledge was profound and practical. It was a reminder that survival required not only physical strength, but also wisdom and adaptability. He felt a growing respect for her culture and the traditions she carried, understanding that her resilience was rooted in generations of experience and knowledge. By the end of the third week, Nayeli was nearly fully recovered. She could walk long distances, carry small loads, and even manage some of the ranch chores independently. Daniel felt a mixture of relief and pride. Relief that she had survived the harsh desert and the dangerous days after she was found. Pride in the way she had faced every challenge with courage and determination. And alongside these feelings, there was a quiet anticipation of what was to come. The journey to her tribe and the unknown that lay beyond the safety of the ranch. Evenings were now moments of reflection and calm. Daniel and Nayeli would sit near the fire, sometimes talking in gestures, sometimes simply watching the stars. Daniel had grown to appreciate her presence in ways he had not expected. She had brought life, energy, and a sense of purpose to his days. He realized that the bond they had formed went beyond simple gratitude. It was a connection built on mutual trust, respect, and the shared experience of surviving hardship together. By the end of the month, it was clear that Nayeli would soon be strong enough to make the journey back to her tribe. Daniel had been preparing for this moment quietly, considering the route, the supplies, and the precautions they would need to take. He knew the journey would not be easy, but he was determined to ensure her safe return. And though he felt a twinge of sadness at the thought of her leaving, he also felt a sense of pride and fulfillment. He had saved a life, yes, but he had also learned about courage, resilience, and the quiet power of human kindness. The morning of their departure arrived with a soft light breaking across the desert horizon. Daniel had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Supplies were gathered carefully: fresh water, dried meat, blankets, and small essentials that Nayeli might need on the journey. He had also mapped the safest route, one that avoided dangerous terrain and allowed them to travel near sources of water. Though the desert was still harsh, Daniel felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. This journey was not just about returning Nayeli to her tribe. It was a test of endurance, patience, and trust for both of them. Nayeli stood beside him, steady and confident. Her strength had returned fully, and Daniel marveled at how much she had recovered. Yet, he knew the desert could be unforgiving, and he had to remain cautious. He handed her a small bundle containing the items she would need, and she accepted it with a quiet nod. There was no need for many words. Their unspoken understanding had grown over weeks of shared care, simple gestures, and quiet moments of trust. Daniel led the way, with Nayeli following carefully, their pace slow but steady. The first few hours of the journey were peaceful. The desert stretched endlessly around them, golden sand blending with scrubby bushes and distant rock formations. Birds called faintly in the distance, and the occasional coyote darted silently across the horizon. Daniel spoke softly to Nayeli, pointing to landmarks and explaining the path ahead. She listened attentively, occasionally pointing at something in the distance, asking questions through gestures. Daniel smiled quietly, realizing that even in the absence of a shared language, they had found a way to communicate, to cooperate, and to navigate the world together. As the day grew hotter, they encountered the first real challenge. The path narrowed near a rocky ridge, the sand giving way to jagged stones. Daniel carefully guided Nayeli step by step, ensuring she did not slip or hurt herself. At one point, she stumbled on a loose stone, and Daniel caught her just in time. The moment was brief, but it reminded him how fragile human life could be in the desert. He felt a surge of protectiveness and determination, vowing silently that he would do everything in his power to keep her safe. Nayeli looked up at him, and for the first time, she smiled fully. A bright and trusting smile, that warmed Daniel's heart. They paused for water under the shade of a lone mesquite tree. Daniel handed her the canteen, watching as she drank deeply, grateful for every drop. He poured some water for himself and sat beside her, feeling the quiet satisfaction of progress. The journey was long and the desert offered no guarantees, but they had each other. The bond between them had deepened further, no longer just rescuer and rescued, but companions facing a shared challenge. Daniel realized that this journey was teaching him lessons about patience, endurance, and empathy that he had never learned on the ranch. As they continued, the desert began to change. The sand gave way to rocky plains, and the sun hung high in the sky, relentless and hot. They moved slowly, resting frequently, taking care to avoid exhaustion. Daniel noticed that Nayeli had begun to observe him closely, learning how he approached each obstacle. She mimicked his careful steps across rocks and his cautious climbing over uneven ground. It was a silent exchange of knowledge, a teaching and learning that went beyond words. Daniel marveled at her resilience and adaptability. He knew that her survival depended not only on physical strength, but also on intelligence and keen observation, qualities she displayed in abundance. By late afternoon, they reached a dry stream bed. Daniel stopped and studied the terrain carefully. The ground was uneven, and he knew they would need to navigate it cautiously to avoid injury. Nayeli watched him silently, her eyes alert. Daniel gestured for her to follow his lead, showing her where to place her feet and how to balance herself. Step by step, they crossed the difficult section. When they reached the other side safely, Nayeli let out a quiet exclamation of relief and gratitude. Daniel nodded, feeling a sense of pride in their teamwork. The desert had been a teacher to both of them, demanding patience, skill, and courage. Night approached, bringing with it cooler temperatures and the quiet sounds of desert wildlife. Daniel found a safe spot to make camp near a small cluster of rocks that offered shelter from the wind. He set up a fire and gathered what little dry wood he could find. Nayeli helped, moving carefully, carrying small sticks and arranging blankets. That night, they shared a simple meal of bread and dried meat, eating quietly under a sky filled with stars. Daniel noticed that Nayeli's eyes reflected the firelight, bright and alert, filled with gratitude and trust. They did not speak much, but the silence was comfortable. It was a shared understanding, a recognition of the hardships they had faced and the journey yet to come. As the fire crackled, Daniel reflected on the lessons of the day. He had always thought of himself as capable, independent, and self-sufficient. But this journey was different. It required patience, empathy, and attentiveness to someone else's needs. He realized that true strength was not measured by physical ability alone, but by the willingness to care, protect, and support another person. Nayeli had shown him courage and resilience beyond what he had imagined, and he felt a deep respect for her. She had survived hardship, injury, and isolation, yet she faced each day with determination and grace. The next morning, they resumed their journey with renewed energy. 9, 10, 2, 9. The path grew more challenging, winding through narrow canyons and rocky hills. At times, Daniel had to climb ahead, testing the path and finding safe footing before helping Nayeli navigate each step. There were moments of tension when loose rocks shifted or the ground crumbled beneath them, but they faced each obstacle together. Daniel often held out his hand, and Nayeli grasped it firmly, relying on his guidance. Their teamwork was seamless, built on trust, experience, and a shared commitment to reaching her tribe safely. During breaks, Daniel encouraged Nayeli to share stories of her life, using gestures and simple words. She pointed to the sky, the mountains, and the desert, showing him places and experiences he could only imagine. He listened attentively, fascinated by her perspective and knowledge. Naeli, in turn, observed his methods for survival, how he tracked the sun, read the land, and navigated difficult terrain. Each learned from the other, blending their strengths into a shared approach to the journey. It was a partnership built not on words alone, but on understanding, respect, and shared experience. Hard. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small oasis. Water pooled quietly among rocks and palm-like plants, a rare gift in the desert. Daniel allowed Naeli to drink first, watching as she filled her hands and drank deeply. He smiled quietly, satisfied by the small comforts they could find along the way. They rested in the shade for several hours, replenishing their strength and preparing for the remainder of the journey. Daniel knew that the desert could change quickly, and he remained alert, watching the skies and listening for sounds of wildlife that might indicate danger. As they set out again, the terrain became even more challenging. Steep inclines and narrow passes required careful navigation. Daniel led the way, breaking the path and testing footing, while Naeli followed cautiously. She had grown stronger, more confident, but the journey demanded constant attention. At one point, they had to cross a narrow ledge with a steep drop on one side. Daniel guided her step by step, offering his hand for support. Her trust in him was complete, and she followed his lead without hesitation. They reached the other side safely, both relieved and grateful for their careful teamwork. Evenings on the trail were moments of reflection. Daniel often sat beside Naeli, watching the stars appear in the vast desert sky. He marveled at the quiet beauty surrounding them and thought about how much this journey had changed him. The ranch that had once defined his life now felt distant, replaced by the sense of purpose found in guiding Naeli safely back to her people. He understood that life could shift unexpectedly, that connections could form in ways he had never anticipated. This journey was teaching him patience, empathy, courage, and the quiet power of trust. Naeli, too, had grown through the journey. Her steps were sure, her confidence restored, and her spirit strengthened by the challenges they faced together. She had learned to rely on Daniel, and in turn he had learned to rely on her resilience, her sharp observation, and her ability to adapt. Each day brought new lessons, new obstacles, and new opportunities to grow closer. Their bond, built on shared hardship and trust, had deepened in ways neither had expected. By the end of the week, they had traveled through difficult terrain, survived scorching days and cold nights, and learned to depend on one another fully. Daniel realized that the journey was more than a physical challenge. It was a test of character, compassion, and humanity. He had witnessed Naeli's courage, her intelligence, and her unwavering determination. In return, she had seen his kindness, patience, and the quiet strength that had guided him through life. Together, they had formed a connection that transcended words, a bond that would endure far beyond the desert. After days of careful travel, Daniel and Naeli finally saw the first signs of her tribe's settlement. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, curling toward the blue sky. The sight brought a mixture of relief and anticipation. Naeli's eyes brightened, and she pointed eagerly toward the distant encampment. Daniel felt a strange emotion he had not expected: pride, relief, and a little nervousness all at once. He had spent weeks guiding her across the desert, protecting her from its dangers, and now they were close to completing the journey. But he also understood that reaching her tribe would not be as simple as arriving at the camp. As they drew closer, the air seemed to carry a sense of caution. The Apache people were watching. Daniel could see figures moving between the tents, observing from a distance. He knew that his presence could be met with suspicion. After all, he was a stranger, a man from the outside, someone who could easily have caused harm rather than offering help. Daniel stopped with Nayeli behind a small hill, giving her a chance to rest before they approached. He crouched beside her, speaking softly, explaining the plan through gestures. She nodded, understanding that they needed to approach carefully and respectfully. With deliberate steps, they moved closer to the settlement. Daniel kept his hands visible, a universal sign of peace. Nayeli walked slightly ahead, signaling to her people that she had returned safely. As they entered the outer edge of the camp, several warriors stepped forward. Their expressions were cautious, eyes narrowing as they assessed the strangers. Daniel could sense their tension and decided to act with calmness and humility. He stopped, bowed his head slightly, and gestured to show he meant no harm. Nayeli stepped forward, her presence a reassurance that he was not a threat. The elders of the tribe soon joined the scene. They were older, dignified, and observant, their eyes studying Daniel carefully. Nayeli approached them first, speaking quickly in her language. Daniel did not understand her words, but he could see the relief and gratitude in her gestures. The elders then turned their attention to him, and he stepped forward slowly, hands still open in a peaceful manner. He pointed to Nayeli, then to himself, and finally made a simple gesture indicating that he had only wished to help her. His tone was calm and sincere, his movements deliberate and respectful. For a long moment, the elders remained silent. Daniel felt the weight of their gaze, wondering if he had misjudged the situation. But then one elder, taller than the others, and with a calm presence, stepped forward. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. Though Daniel could not understand the language fully, he could feel the meaning in the tone. The elder was questioning his intentions, trying to understand why he had helped Nayeli and what he expected in return. Daniel gestured again, shaking his head slightly to show that he wanted nothing but her safety. His sincerity was evident in his posture, his tone, and the careful way he had treated Nayeli throughout their journey. After tense moments, the elder exchanged words with the others. They whispered and gestured among themselves, discussing Daniel's presence. Nayeli stood quietly beside him, occasionally placing a hand on his arm as if to reassure him. Finally, the elder returned his attention to Daniel. He gestured for him to sit, and Daniel obeyed, taking a careful, respectful seat on the ground. The elder then spoke again, more gently this time. Daniel realized that they were beginning to trust him. They were acknowledging his courage and his honesty. The tribe began to show their gratitude in small ways. Some members brought food and water for Daniel, gestures of hospitality that he accepted with humility. Nayeli smiled at him, her eyes filled with relief and gratitude. Daniel felt a warmth spread through him. He had done the right thing, and now he could see the impact of his actions. The elders continued to watch him closely, assessing whether he would respect their customs and traditions. Daniel understood the importance of these moments. His behavior now would define the trust between him and the tribe. Over the next few hours, the elders invited Daniel to witness some of their customs. They demonstrated rituals that honored nature, the animals, and the spirit of the land. Daniel watched quietly, careful not to intrude, but eager to learn. He observed the precision of their movements, the rhythm of their songs, and the reverence they showed in each gesture. Nayeli stood beside him, guiding him with small gestures, helping him understand what was happening. Daniel felt a deep respect for their traditions, realizing that their knowledge and practices had been passed down through generations and held meaning far beyond his understanding. During this time, Daniel also learned about the tribe's connection to the land. They showed him how they hunted, how they gathered plants for medicine, and how they tracked water sources and animals. He listened intently, fascinated by their understanding of the environment. He had spent his life on the ranch, caring for cattle and managing the land in his own way. But he realized that the Apache people had a wisdom that went far deeper than his experience. They observed nature with patience, respect, and awareness that had kept them alive in the harsh desert for generations. Nayeli, now fully reintegrated into her tribe, expressed gratitude toward Daniel in her own way. She brought him closer to the elders, helping to bridge the gap between their worlds. The elder who had first questioned him now nodded in acknowledgement, a sign of respect that Daniel felt deeply. For the first time, he realized that his actions had earned him a place, even if only temporarily, among people whose lives and culture were entirely different from his own. The experience humbled him and inspired him to continue approaching life with compassion and courage. As the evening fell, Daniel was offered a place to rest within the tribe's settlement. He declined to stay long, knowing he had responsibilities back at his ranch, but he accepted the hospitality for the night. Sitting by the fire with Nayeli beside him, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the challenges of the desert, the moments of fear and exhaustion, and the quiet victories they had shared. Most of all, he reflected on the power of human connection, the way trust, compassion, and courage could bridge even the widest gaps between cultures and experiences. The tribe's children, curious and lively, approached him cautiously at first. Daniel greeted them with gentle gestures, offering small smiles and nods. They began to warm to him, drawn by his calm presence and the quiet way he treated everyone with respect. Nayeli laughed softly as she guided them in simple games, teaching Daniel a few words in her language along the way. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a sense of belonging that he had never experienced on his ranch. It was a fleeting but powerful feeling, proof that acts of kindness could create connections that transcended backgrounds and circumstances. By the next morning, Daniel prepared to leave the settlement. Nayeli and the elders had expressed their gratitude in many ways, through gestures, small gifts, and heartfelt words in their language. Though he could not understand every word, the meaning was clear. He had saved a life, and in return he had gained respect, understanding, and a profound connection to a culture that he had only begun to appreciate. Nayeli walked beside him as they approached the edge of the settlement. She held his hand briefly, a gesture of friendship, gratitude, and mutual respect. Daniel felt a warmth in his heart that he knew would last a lifetime. Before leaving, Daniel promised the elders that he would always respect their traditions and continue to honor the lessons he had learned. They nodded in acknowledgement, recognizing his sincerity and integrity. Nayeli gave him a small token, a piece of cloth embroidered with symbols from her tribe, as a gift of gratitude. Daniel accepted it with care, knowing that it was more than a simple object. It was a symbol of trust, respect, and the bond they had forged through hardship and courage. As he turned to leave, Daniel looked back at the tribe, the smoke rising from the fires, and the familiar faces of the people he had come to respect. He realized that his life had changed in ways he had never anticipated. Saving Nayeli had been an act of compassion, but it had also opened his eyes to a world beyond his ranch. It had taught him lessons about courage, empathy, respect, and the power of human connection. He had ventured into the desert to save a life, and in return he had been welcomed into a community, honored for his honesty, and changed forever by the experience. The journey back to his ranch was quiet. Nayeli walked with him part way before returning fully to her people. Daniel watched her go, feeling pride in her strength and relief in knowing she was safe. The desert stretched before him, vast and familiar, but he saw it now with new eyes. He understood the fragility of life, the importance of trust, and the value of courage, not just his own, but that of every person he had met along the way. The experience had transformed him, shaping his character, his perspective, and his sense of purpose. The journey back to his ranch was quiet and reflective. Daniel walked along the dusty trail, the sun low on the horizon, painting the desert in warm shades of gold and orange. The wind whispered softly through the scrub and rocks, carrying with it a sense of calm after the long weeks of hardship and travel. Though the desert was the same as it had always been, Daniel felt that he saw it differently now. Every rock, every plant, every rising sun seemed to hold more meaning. He thought of Nayeli, safe with her tribe, and a quiet warmth spread through him, a mixture of relief, pride, and gratitude. Returning to the ranch, Daniel noticed how familiar yet changed everything felt. The hills stretched as they always had, and the cattle grazed quietly, unaware of the long journey he had undertaken. But Daniel himself had changed. His steps felt lighter, yet purposeful, as though he carried with him not only his daily responsibilities, but also the lessons of courage, trust, and compassion that he had learned from Nayeli and her tribe. For years he had lived a solitary life, content with routine and solitude. Now he understood that connection with others, even across differences of culture and language, was a powerful force that could change a person's life. The days following his return were filled with a mixture of routine and reflection. Daniel resumed his chores, feeding the cattle, mending fences, and checking the water sources, but his thoughts often drifted to Nayeli. He thought about her courage, the strength she had shown in the desert, and the grace with which she had faced every challenge. He remembered the way she had smiled after each small victory, the quiet trust in her eyes, and the gentle guidance she had offered him as they navigated dangerous terrain together. Those memories were a reminder of the profound impact one life could have on another, and Daniel carried them like a quiet treasure in his heart. At times, Daniel would take walks along the edge of the ranch, tracing the paths they had once traveled together. He imagined the conversations they had shared through gestures and simple words, the moments of laughter, and the small victories they had celebrated along the way. He realized that the journey had been more than a physical challenge. It had been a lesson in patience, empathy, and understanding. Daniel reflected on the trust they had built, a trust that had transcended language and culture. It had been a bond forged in hardship, strengthened by shared challenges, and sealed by mutual respect. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the fence that had been damaged during a recent storm, Daniel found himself thinking about the tribe's wisdom. He remembered the careful ways they observed the land, the respect they showed for every living thing, and the traditions they followed with patience and reverence. He realized that these lessons were not just for survival in the desert. They were lessons for life itself. Daniel began to notice the land around him more carefully. The subtle changes in weather, the movements of the animals, and the plants that thrived despite the harsh conditions. He approached his work with a new perspective, blending his experience with the understanding he had gained from Nayeli and her people. Weeks passed, and life on the ranch returned to its steady rhythm. Yet Daniel no longer saw his work as mere routine. Every task, every chore, every sunrise held a deeper meaning. Caring for his animals and his land felt richer, more connected to the world around him. He remembered Nayeli's quiet courage and the way she had adapted to every challenge, and he found inspiration in her resilience. Her example had taught him that strength was not just measured in physical ability, but in patience, perseverance, and a willingness to trust and care for others. One morning, a small package arrived from Nayeli. Inside was a piece of cloth, carefully embroidered with symbols and designs from her tribe. Daniel held it in his hands, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and connection. It was a simple gift, but it carried profound meaning, a symbol of trust, respect, and the bond they had formed during their shared journey. He hung the cloth in his cabin, a reminder of the lessons he had learned, the life he had touched, and the life that had touched his own in return. Each time he looked at it, he remembered the desert, the journey, and the courage of the young woman who had changed his life forever. Daniel also began to share his story with those who came to the ranch, travelers, neighbors, and occasional visitors. He spoke not of heroism or bravery, but of trust, patience, and compassion. He explained how simple acts of care and courage could ripple far beyond a single moment, touching lives in ways that might never be fully understood. People listened, captivated not just by the story itself, but by the sincerity in his voice and the lessons woven into every word. Daniel had discovered that sharing knowledge and experience could be just as rewarding as the act of helping itself. As the seasons changed, Daniel continued to live quietly on his ranch, but the experience with Nayeli remained a constant presence in his thoughts. He found that he approached life with more patience and empathy, not just for humans, but for every living creature around him. The ranch, once a place of solitude, now felt like a space of learning and reflection. He observed the animals, the land, and the sky with a heightened awareness, appreciating the interconnectedness of life and the lessons that could be drawn from even the simplest moments. Occasionally, he would receive news from Nayeli's tribe. Messengers would bring word of her well-being, and Daniel would feel a quiet joy at knowing she was safe and thriving. Each update reinforced the bond they had formed and reminded him of the journey they had undertaken together. It was a connection that distance could not diminish, a testament to the enduring power of trust and kindness. Daniel often thought about the lessons they had learned from one another, the courage to face danger, the patience to nurture healing, and the respect for cultures and experiences different from one's own. Years passed, and Daniel's life continued on the ranch, filled with work, reflection, and quiet satisfaction. Yet the experience with Nayeli and her tribe remained a defining chapter of his life. It had taught him that bravery was not only about facing physical danger, but also about acting with integrity, compassion, and humility. It had shown him that trust could bridge gaps between cultures, languages, and backgrounds, creating bonds that lasted far longer than a single journey. Daniel understood that life was unpredictable, and sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could leave the greatest impact. One evening, as he watched the sun set over the rolling hills of his ranch, Daniel felt a deep sense of peace. The world was vast, unpredictable, and sometimes harsh, yet it was also full of wonder, connection, and beauty. He remembered the desert, the long journey with Nayeli, and the tribe that had welcomed him with cautious respect. Each memory was a reminder that life was not meant to be lived in isolation. It was meant to be shared, nurtured, and honored with kindness, patience, and courage. Daniel realized that he had not only helped save a life, he had been transformed by the experience. Looking toward the horizon, Daniel thought about the future. He knew that the lessons he had learned would stay with him for the rest of his life. He would continue to care for his ranch, his animals, and the land with renewed purpose. He would remember Nayeli's courage, the trust she had placed in him, and the way her tribe had taught him the value of respect, tradition, and community. And though he lived in a quiet place far from towns and cities, he understood that his actions, his choices, and his compassion had created ripples far beyond the boundaries of his ranch. Daniel smiled quietly to himself, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. The journey had changed him in ways he could never have anticipated. It had shown him the depth of human resilience, the power of trust, and the extraordinary bonds that could form even in the most unlikely circumstances. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he felt equipped to face them with patience, courage, and understanding. And most importantly, he carried with him the knowledge that a single act of kindness could change not only one life, but also the heart and spirit of another. In the quiet nights that followed, Daniel would often sit by the fire, reflecting on the journey, the desert, and the woman who had forever altered the course of his life. He kept the embroidered cloth from Nayeli nearby, a tangible reminder of their shared experiences and the enduring connection between their worlds. Each time he touched it, he remembered the journey, the challenges, and the moments of trust and courage. It was a symbol of the life he had saved and the life that had, in turn, shaped him in ways words could never fully capture. Daniel's life returned to a steady rhythm, but he was no longer the same man who had first walked across the desert to rescue Nayeli. He had learned lessons that went beyond the boundaries of his ranch. The lessons of compassion, empathy, respect, and the quiet power of human connection. He carried these lessons in his heart every day, in every decision, and in every act of care he gave to the land, the animals, and the people who entered his life. The journey had ended, but its impact was permanent. And so Daniel lived the rest of his days with a quiet wisdom shaped by the desert, by Nayeli, and by the tribe that had welcomed him. His ranch remained a place of solitude, yet it was also a place of reflection, growth, and connection. He had learned that true courage was not only about surviving the harshness of life, but about acting with integrity, compassion, and understanding. The experience had transformed him, and in that transformation he found a sense of purpose, fulfillment, and enduring peace.